It's hard to imagine today, but in the late 1980s, a compact German coupe with boxy lines and flared fenders quietly rewrote the rules of performance cars. This was the BMW E30 M3. Born in 1986 to satisfy racing regulations, yet destined to become far more than just a homologation project. At first glance, it didn't look like an exotic supercar. It looked like a modest 3 Series with an attitude problem. But that was the genius. The E30 M3 carried a race-bred engine, suspension, and bodywork that turned an everyday platform into a precision instrument, capable of shaming rivals on circuits across Europe and thrilling drivers on public roads. And in doing so, it tapped into a uniquely intoxicating formula, the accessibility of a sedan combined with the thrill of motorsport. What followed was a tidal wave of championships, a cult following, and eventually a leap into collector car royalty. Today, the E30 M3 is one of the most sought-after performance icons of its era, with values climbing into territory once reserved for far more exotic machines. But its legend wasn't built overnight. It was forged through relentless competition, engineering daring, and a cultural moment that made this little coupe stand tall against giants. Stick around as we trace how a homologation special became a touchstone for enthusiasts worldwide, why its design and character remain unmatched, and what its enduring status reveals about how we measure greatness in cars. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hit like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments which legendary machine you'd like to see covered next. The BMW E30 M3 arrived in 1986 with a purpose as sharp as its squared-off silhouette: to dominate Group A touring car racing, while still being a machine any customer could purchase at a dealership. From the very beginning, it was a contradiction that worked in its favor. To understand how this car made such an impact, we need to look closely at the forces that shaped it. Forces of regulation, competition, and ambition. And the E30 M3's story begins not in luxury, but in necessity. Microstory, racing-dictated design. Group A regulations required a manufacturer to sell at least 5,000 road-going versions of any car it intended to field in competition. That's why the BMW E30 M3 existed at all. Engineers didn't start with a blank sheet. They started with a mandate. By taking the standard 3 Series as a base and re-engineering it into something sharper, BMW Motorsport created a road car built not for style points, but for trophies. The flared arches weren't fashion statements, they were room for wider tires. The rear wing wasn't for looks, it was for stability on high-speed straights. The E30 M3 wasn't about being beautiful, it was about being unbeatable. Context digest. In the mid-1980s, the automotive world was shifting. Regulators demanded cleaner cars, buyers demanded comfort, and racing bodies demanded fairness. Many manufacturers struggled to balance it all. BMW, however, saw an opportunity to channel its motorsport heritage into a product that could bridge those worlds. The E30 M3 wasn't a compromise. It was a weapon disguised as a commuter. Microstory. Under the hood, BMW ditched the 6-cylinder engines that were becoming its signature and instead chose a 4-cylinder design, the S14. This wasn't a downgrade. It was a deliberate move. By trimming weight from the front end and building an engine that thrived at high revs, BMW created a power plant perfect for racing. With around 192 horsepower in US trim and even more in European versions, the S14 sang at the top of its rev range, rewarding drivers who pushed it hard. It wasn't about brute force, it was about finesse and momentum. And for racers, that was the secret sauce. Reflection bridge. What stands out is how every choice in the E30 M3 was guided by racing first and customer convenience second. That's rare today, but it defined the car's DNA. Microstory. The chassis was equally important. Engineers gave the E30 M3 a wider track, stiffer suspension, and reworked geometry that turned corners into its natural hunting ground. The steering wasn't just quick, it was communicative, a direct line between road and driver. On winding back roads or hairpin-heavy circuits, the car danced instead of lumbering. This wasn't a machine you drove casually. It was one that demanded and rewarded skill. Every input mattered, every correction was felt. Owners often say it made them better drivers, not just faster ones. Context digest. On the racing stage, the E30 M3 proved its worth quickly. It became a powerhouse in touring car series around the globe, winning races not by accident, but by overwhelming consistency. While rivals brought bigger engines or flashier designs, the E30 M3 showed that precision and balance could topple raw horsepower. Championships in DTM and other series cemented its credibility. And credibility was the one thing no amount of marketing could fake. Micro story. Away from the track, the road-going E30 M3 built a loyal following. Drivers who had no intention of racing still bought it for its purity. They valued the way it cornered, the way the gearbox demanded precision, the way the whole car felt cohesive. It was not the fastest thing on the Autobahn, but it might have been the most satisfying. Owners described it as a car that grew with you. The more you learned, the more it revealed. That bond became part of its mystique, reflection bridge. At this point, the BMW E30 M3 was no longer just a homologation special. It was becoming something greater, something symbolic of BMW's ability to make racing tangible for everyday enthusiasts. Context Digest. The 1980s were a time when many performance cars were leaning into flash, with dramatic styling or turbocharged bravado. The E30 M3 went the opposite direction. It was almost conservative in design, but purposeful in execution. Those box flares and spoilers were aerodynamic tools, not vanity add-ons. That honesty appealed to a certain type of enthusiast, the type who cared more about lap times than magazine covers. It cultivated a different kind of desirability, one built on function over fashion. Micro story. Of course, owning an E30 M3 wasn't without challenges. The S14 engine demanded maintenance and loved to rev, which meant wear and tear for careless owners. Suspension parts needed attention, and bodywork unique to the M3 made repairs expensive. But to many, those challenges weren't deterrents. They were rites of passage. Taking care of an M3 was part of the relationship. It made ownership feel like membership in an unspoken club, where knowledge and dedication were just as important as money. That sense of belonging only added to the car's aura. And so, by the time the 1980s turned into the 1990s, the BMW E30 M3 had already transcended its role as a race homologation car. It had become a cultural icon, admired not just for what it could do on the track, but for what it represented to enthusiasts everywhere. And the next stage of its story would show how that reputation turned into global legend. The BMW E30 M3 entered the 1990s as a proven champion, and by this point it was more than just a competitive touring car. It was a legend in motion. Having conquered DTM and touring car championships worldwide, the E30 M3 now had the weight of mythology behind it, and with that came new layers of meaning. This wasn't just a Fast 3 series anymore. It was the car that defined what a driver's machine could be. Micro story. On the track, its victories stacked up in ways no one anticipated. The E30 M3 didn't just win races, it dominated entire seasons. Consistency, reliability, and balance gave it an edge that brute force competitors couldn't replicate. Watching it race became an experience in precision. It seemed to float through corners with uncanny composure, while rivals struggled to keep pace. Fans didn't just cheer for a BMW, they cheered for a machine that embodied discipline and excellence. Context Digest. By the early 1990s, the competition was catching up. Rivals introduced turbocharged engines, advanced aerodynamics, and more aggressive strategies. Yet the E30 M3 held its ground by sticking to its formula of precision engineering and driver connection. It didn't always have the biggest numbers on paper, but it had something rivals couldn't match: a reputation for extracting everything out of a lap. That reputation became a psychological weapon as much as a mechanical one. Micro story. Special editions of the E30 M3 began to emerge, each deepening its mystique. Models like the Evolution and Sport Evolution pushed the limits with more power, revised aerodynamics, and lighter construction. These weren't marketing gimmicks. They were tangible refinements born from racing needs. The Sport Evolution in particular, with its adjustable spoilers and high-strung 2.5-liter engine, showed just how far the platform could be taken. For enthusiasts lucky enough to own one, these were not cars but artifacts, living, breathing pieces of motorsport history. Reflection bridge. What makes the E30 M3's arc fascinating is how it blurred the lines between track machine and cultural symbol, between hardcore engineering and emotional resonance. Micro story. Outside of the racing circuits, the car became a fixture in magazines and posters, cementing itself as an aspirational icon. Teenagers who saw the flared silhouette in a showroom or read about it in performance reviews grew up with the E30 M3 as their definition of cool. The cultural impact stretched far beyond Germany. reaching enthusiasts in the US who longed for the European spec versions with higher output and racing pedigree. The idea of the E30 M3 became almost as powerful as the car itself. Context digest. The 1990s also saw the model's practicality playing a role in its enduring appeal. It was still a 3 Series at heart, which meant it had usable rear seats, decent visibility, and a chassis that didn't punish you on long drives. That usability set it apart from many sports cars that sacrificed comfort for performance. It made the E30 M3 something more versatile. A car that could carry groceries on Friday, carve corners on Saturday, and dominate a track on Sunday. Micro story. Yet the passage of time also introduced new dynamics. As newer M3 generations arrived with more power, more technology, and more refinement, the E30 risked becoming overshadowed. But instead of fading, it grew in stature. Enthusiasts began to recognize that newer models, while faster, lacked the raw simplicity of the original. The E30 M3 stood out not in spite of its age, but because of it. It became the benchmark by which all successors were judged, the car against which every ultimate driving machine claim was measured. Reflection bridge. This is where the narrative shifts, from being a contemporary hero to being a timeless reference point, a symbol of purity in an increasingly complex automotive world. Context digest. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the used market began to shift. What was once a relatively affordable performance car started climbing in value. Collectors noticed the rarity of unmodified examples, and enthusiasts realized that the E30 M3 was more than nostalgia. It was a tangible investment. Scarcity drove demand, and demand turned into reverence. What had once been attainable was rapidly becoming aspirational once again. Microstory. Stories of owners refusing to part with their E30 M3s became common. For some, it wasn't about money, but about identity. The car represented their youth, their victories, or their bond with a machine that felt alive. It wasn't just steel and rubber. It was memory and emotion. And that is when the E30 M3 crossed into a new realm, where value wasn't only measured in dollars, but in the intangible pull it had over people's lives. And so the BMW E30 M3 evolved from a regulation-driven racer into a touchstone of culture, engineering, and emotion, setting the stage for its ultimate transformation into one of the most desired collector cars of its era. The BMW E30 M3, by the time it had already cemented its racing dominance and cultural resonance, was beginning to transition into something even more enduring, a collector's dream. What makes this shift so remarkable is that it wasn't orchestrated by marketing departments or limited edition hype alone. It was the organic result of a car that embodied purity, purpose, and history. As newer generations of the M3 grew more powerful and more complex, the original stood as a reminder of what driving once felt like. Raw, connected, and unfiltered. Microstory. In the 2000s, you could still find E30 M3s sitting on used car lots or tucked away in classified ads for reasonable sums. At that time, they were seen by many as old performance cars, valuable mostly to die-hard fans. But those who recognized their significance, those who understood how rare it was for a manufacturer to build a car this uncompromising, began snapping them up. Slowly, the tide turned and values began to creep upward. What was once attainable weekend fun was quietly transforming into a blue-chip collectible. Context digest. The collector car market thrives on stories, and the E30 M3 had them in abundance. It was the most successful touring car of its era, the foundation of BMW's motorsport legacy, and the origin of a nameplate that still commands respect. Add in its unique design features, like the widened fenders, reworked suspension, and S14 engine, and it became more than a car. It was an artifact of an era when racing authenticity trickled directly onto the street. Microstory. Enthusiasts who had owned one in the 1980s and 1990s began to realize just how hard it was to find clean examples decades later. Many had been raced, modified, or driven into the ground. Survivors became precious, and when pristine models occasionally came up for sale, bidding wars erupted. Suddenly, the E30 M3 wasn't just a fun car to drive. It was a financial asset, with values soaring into 6 figures for rare trims like the Sport Evolution. What had once been a dream for young enthusiasts became the crown jewel of seasoned collectors. Reflection bridge. This was the full-circle transformation, from homologation necessity to cultural icon to investment-grade classic. Microstory. Today, owning an E30 M3 is both a privilege and a challenge. The driving experience remains magical, steering that communicates every pebble, an engine that rewards high revs, and a chassis that feels alive in your hands. But the realities of ownership are less romantic. Parts can be scarce, maintenance is demanding, and the cost of keeping one in pristine shape can rival modern luxury cars. Yet for those who own one, these hurdles are part of the reward, proof that the bond between machine and driver is worth preserving at any cost. Context Digest. The rise in value has also reshaped who owns these cars. Once the domain of young enthusiasts, the E30 M3 now sits in climate-controlled garages, displayed at concours events, and carefully curated in collections. This shift has sparked debate. Is the car still for driving, or has it become too precious to risk? For many, the answer is both. The E30 M3 is one of those rare machines that commands respect, whether it's being driven flat out on a back road or admired under spotlights at an auction. Micro story. Beyond the market, its influence endures in how we think about performance cars. The E30 M3 set a template: balance over brute force, engagement over excess, and purpose-driven design. Even as horsepower wars escalate and technology isolates drivers from the road, enthusiasts still point to the E30 as the gold standard of what a performance car should feel like. It's not nostalgia. It's recognition that something truly timeless was achieved in that boxy silhouette. And so, the BMW E30 M3's journey concludes not as a footnote in motorsport history, but as a lasting benchmark of driving purity. A rolling reminder that the most valuable cars aren't always the ones with the biggest engines or the flashiest shapes, but the ones that capture our imagination and refuse to let go. The BMW E30 M3 has carried us on a journey from regulation-driven creation to motorsport dominance, from cultural icon to one of the most coveted collector cars in the world. In tracing its arc, we've seen how a car born out of necessity became an object of desire, how something built to satisfy Group A rules grew into a legend that transcended its era. For US viewers, the E30 M3's legacy has special weight. It represents a time when manufacturers were willing to put engineering purity ahead of mass market convenience. And that approach created something that still feels fresh decades later. For owners, the reality today is layered. The E30 M3 is not cheap to buy nor simple to maintain. It demands attention, patience, and resources, but that's also what makes it meaningful. To keep one alive is to preserve a piece of history, to act as steward of a car that tells a story far bigger than any individual garage. When enthusiasts describe it as more than transportation, they mean it literally. It's a portal into an era when feedback and finesse defined performance. In the collector market, the E30 M3 has become a benchmark, one of the few 1980s performance cars to achieve true blue-chip status. It's not just rarity that drives the prices, it's the mythology. It's the knowledge that this car didn't just win races, it won hearts, and that the qualities it represents, clarity of purpose, driver engagement, and motorsport credibility, are increasingly scarce in today's automotive landscape. Its influence is everywhere, in the way enthusiasts judge modern M cars, in how rivals chase the same elusive balance, and in how younger generations still place posters of this boxy coupe on their walls. It has become the yardstick for authenticity, the proof that smaller, lighter, and more focused can still mean greater. The BMW E30 M3, produced between 1986 and 1991, was never supposed to be immortal. It was built to win races, then to sell enough road cars to make those races possible. But through its victories, its charisma, and its unshakable connection with drivers, it achieved something far more enduring. It became a touchstone of driving purity, a cultural artifact, and a collector's treasure. And as long as enthusiasts value the bond between human and machine, the E30 M3 will never be forgotten. Because some legends don't fade. They simply shift gears into eternity.